When I was a kid, I loved fairy tales because there were knights fighting dragons and I loved everything medieval. I would flip through books about the history of warfare without really reading it, because I just wanted to look at the pictures of medieval armors. I also loved heraldry, movies about medieval jousting, and everything that contained armors, swords, knights, castles, dragons, and so on. That's why I naturally gravitated towards fantasy, and I was introduced to it thanks to my parents, who read Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit to me and my siblings when we were kids. As I grew up, I devoured every fantasy book I could get my hands on, and I've read books like The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Eragon, Dragon Realm, Dragonlance, The Sword of Truth, The Chronicles of Prydain, Discworld, The Neverending Story, and so many other fantasy books. I've also played games like Diablo, Gothic, World of Warcraft, Oblivion, and so on. As a creative and nerdy kid, I loved fantasy because it was an escape from school, bullying, and just mundane life. I often pictured what it would be like to live in a fantasy world full of adventures as a powerful mage. I know now that it was mainly about escapism and power fantasy for me at that age, but when I turned 15, I discovered a different fantasy. I was browsing YouTube one day and there was a trailer for a game called The Witcher, where some white-haired dude fought a monster in the middle of a castle. Because I was always searching for new and cool fantasy games, I started researching it immediately. I don't know if I remember this correctly, but I think that the website for the game had this interactive menu where Geralt was meditating inside some castle, and the things around him, like his swords or some maps in the background, essentially represented the different aspects of the game, which you could click on and read more about. For example, the loot behind Geralt represented the soundtrack, if I remember correctly. Some of these objects were animated, so if you would hover over them with your mouse cursor, they would move or make some sound. And I know that it doesn't sound like anything special nowadays, but back then I was blown away by it. I remember that LucasArts did these cool interactive websites as well for games like Bounty Hunter or Force Unleashed. I vividly remember the menu with Starkiller, where he just stood there moving only slightly, but once in a while he would shoot force lightning from his hand and then go back to his standing. I know that it doesn't sound like anything special, but I was always a sucker for well-made details like that. So just the menu of the Witcher website made an impression on me, but then there were even some concept art pictures like this one with Temerian Knights, for example, and the low fantasy medieval aesthetic really spoke to me because I grew up visiting castles and reenactment events where I would see more realistic armors than I was used to in other fantasy games, so seeing it in The Witcher felt a bit nostalgic and also unique because most fantasy games had this epic high fantasy aesthetic where the armors were usually comically huge and unrealistic, and the swords were either bulky with some magical spells or over-decorated with unnecessary spikes, so they would look cooler, I guess, but that's just impractical and I don't like it. The website had some songs from the soundtrack that you could download, which I of course did immediately. The game wasn't out yet, but the trailer said that the game is based on a fantasy book series by Andrzej Sapkowski, and when I looked it up, I found out that it has already been translated into my language, so I borrowed it from the library and started reading it right away. And I was hooked immediately. This was unlike anything I've read before. The fantasy I was used to would usually be epic high fantasy with some dark lord trying to conquer the world, and the main hero was often special in some way and the most important person in that world, or chosen one if you will. It was the stereotypical good versus evil story, and The Witcher was a complete opposite of that. The main hero wasn't that special because he was one of the many Witchers, and he was famous only to some people just because his bard friend had made him known, but at the same time most people in that world had no idea who he was, and they didn't care. In fact, because the Witchers are shunned, he would often end up getting stoned, chased away, and so on. He would also often get injured in fights, and even though he'd win in the end, he would get his ass handed to him at the same time. You know how I said that fantasy books and games were a power fantasy for me because I liked imagining that I'm someone special and powerful? As I grew up, I started to realize that that probably won't happen and that I'm not that special. I discovered The Witcher right at that time, and it was so relatable to me because Geralt wasn't the most important person in his world either. He wasn't that special, and he wasn't any kind of overpowered badass. In fact, he would often barely survive the fights. Another relatable thing was that this wasn't any kind of good versus evil story. Our world never worked like that either. So I liked that there are just kingdoms and empires waging war against each other in The Witcher, and there are often these nuanced, morally grey situations where nobody is in the right and they are all at fault in some way. Even cliché fantasy tropes were flipped on its head here. For example, elves are not these ethereal beings like in The Lord of the Rings. They are actually struggling to survive, and humans are often racist towards them. And inspiration for this is clearly a mix of Native Americans and Jews, because it's mentioned a few times throughout the books that humans want to put elves in reservations, there are ghettos for non-humans, and sometimes even pogroms happen. It just seemed like a way more realistic and adult take on the fantasy genre to me. I discovered The Witcher at the right age, when I needed something like that. Do you know how people often say that The Witcher 3 ruined other games for them because it was so good that it makes every other game look bad in comparison? Well, that's what The Witcher books did to me with fantasy in general. Even though I still occasionally enjoy epic high fantasy when I'm playing board games, for example, and I want to experience that classical D&D or Magic the Gathering vibe, I just can't go back to the way I used to view fantasy, and I just prefer the more realistic and ordinary low fantasy medieval setting, because it's more relatable to me. Another thing that made me fall in love with this fantasy was that it felt nostalgic, like home, and that's because The Witcher is partly based on our culture here in Central Europe. And in the books there were many references to things I grew up with. For example, the short story with Striga immediately took me back to my childhood, because as a kid I saw this Czech live-action fairy tale, where a cursed princess dies, her royal parents put her dead body in a bed, and guards have to stand in front of her chamber to guard her body. However, she starts killing them, and the main hero is eventually sent to her chamber to spend a night there and save her. She gets up from her bed and tempts him, but he jumps in her place on the bed. As the morning comes, she begs him to let her back, but he doesn't listen, and because she's not lying asleep in her bed in the morning, her curse breaks and she's saved. See how the plot points of the fairy tale are exactly the same as in the short story with Striga? It's because very similar fairy tales were written in Poland and in my country during Romanticism. Our version was written by Božena Němcová, and we have two different live-action fairy tales as adaptations of this story. In Poland it was written by Roman Zmorski, and Sapkowski eventually based The Witcher on this story. By the way, I've made a video about the original fairy tale if you would be interested. And there are other references to our culture in the books, like for example the custom of burning the effigy of Falka. In Time of Contempt, Vilgefortz mentions that children still burn an effigy of Falka on Samhain's Eve, and at the beginning of the book there are lyrics for a song they sing during that custom. It all sounds very similar to a custom we have in common with Poles, and that's burning and drowning an effigy of Slavic goddess Morana, or Marzana as she's known in Poland. I've made a whole video about this custom, but to briefly explain it here, Morana is essentially personification of winter, and this custom is also often performed by children who take an effigy of Morana out of the village to some stream while singing a song about the goddess. They set the effigy on fire and throw it in the water, and symbolically get rid of the last traces of the winter in their village this way. There's also a part in Tower of the Swallow where an old beggar is telling stories about Samhain night to some soldiers, and he's talking about superstitions around this holiday, like stabbing a knife into the threshold of the door as a protection from spirits, and putting a food in a bowl in front of it to appease the spirits. This always reminded me of our holiday called Dušičky a bit, and when I was doing a video about it last year and did some more research around it, I found out that the holiday is essentially equivalent to the Polish holiday called Jadi, where it's custom to leave food for the spirits of your ancestors. A special role during this holiday was played by beggars, who in many regions were also called Jadi. This coincidence of names was not accidental, because in the folklore of itinerants, the beggars Jadi were seen as mediation figures and connectors with the afterlife. Therefore, people asked them to pray for the souls of their deceased ancestors, offering food or cash donations in return. So that can't be just a coincidence that Sapkowski has put a beggar in this scene and the guy talks about a custom of leaving food to the spirits. I think that that's clearly inspired by Jadi, and it's again something that reminds me of our culture here in Central Europe. One small detail that I also always liked was that Geralt often says that death is walking in his footsteps, but he never looks back. One of my favorite Czech live-action fairy tales is called Honza málem králem, and in this fairy tale, death is also following the main hero Honza the whole story, and she's played by this creepy old lady. When Honza is returning home from the king with a chest full of gold on his cart, she finally catches up to him, gets in his way, but because he doesn't stop, she has to jump aside, and as she drops her scythe, Honza runs it over with his cart and breaks the blade. So yeah, the fact that Geralt is also followed by death always reminded me of this fairy tale from my childhood a bit. Another thing is that Sintra might have been inspired by my country, and Kalante by one of our legendary female rulers, but that's just my theory and I want to do a whole separate video about it at some point. And there are other things, like the many monsters lifted straight from Slavic folklore, or the elven goddess from the short story The Edge of the World, and one of her names being Živa, which is a Slavic goddess of life. Then there are all the Slavic names like Novigrad, Velehrad, Venzlav, Vesemir, Vizimir, Vratimir, Dragomir, Nedamir, Radovit, Tretogor, Stregobor, Rozrok a Bodrok, Libuše, Govorožec, Stribok, Pogvist, Pereplut, and so on. These are just some I've written down, and there's probably even more. That's why I find it funny when somebody says that the Witcher books are not Slavic. And I'm not saying that they are exclusively Slavic, I know that the world of The Witcher is a mix of different cultures, but to say that there's nothing Slavic about The Witcher is just dumb. You'd have to be blind. Like, how else am I supposed to imagine a village called Govorožec where they have a small stone chapel with a doll representing a unicorn, which is made out of straw because when it was made of gold, then silver, then copper, then bone and wood, it was stolen every time. So the villagers made it out of straw, and since then nobody has stolen it because it's so cheap. Of course I imagine Govorožec as some of our villages in Central Europe. Firstly, just because of the name, and secondly, we have small chapels, shrines, crosses or statues of saints in the middle of villages, beside the roads, or in the fields everywhere in our countryside, and I've seen my fair share of them vandalized by some assholes over the years. So this anecdote from the Tower of the Swallow definitely reminds me of the mentality here. And that's what I love about the Witcher books. It's not just the Slavic names or the references to our culture, it's also the portrayal and mentality of commoners. I say this a lot, but the same way you can feel English mentality in the Shire, because Tolkien was inspired by his childhood in the English countryside, you can feel Polish and Slavic mentality throughout the countryside in The Witcher. Sapkowski gave villagers and the countryside character and made them believable, so they feel like actual people which you could meet in European countryside or other Slavic countries. And that's why The Witcher is so unique to me. There isn't really a fantasy in the mainstream that would be similar to it. Most from what I've read, seen or played are these generic epic high fantasy worlds, which are all similar to each other because they are based on the tired old D&D tropes. I don't know about any other fantasy which would have this low fantasy medieval aesthetic and marry it with the rustic setting of a believable countryside, which has an actual folklore vibe, and the villagers are not just cardboard cutouts or NPCs who stand on one place all day, waiting for the adventurers to come so they can give them a quest. But I think that I've rambled enough about the Witcher books, so let's move on to the first game. As I said, I downloaded several songs of the soundtrack from the website and I listened to them over and over as I was reading the books, and I'm glad I did that, because when the game finally came out and I started playing it, these two mediums merged together so well in my mind thanks to the soundtrack. But even without that, the atmosphere in the game just felt exactly like in the books. For example, this is an excerpt from A Shard of Ice.
He still did not enjoy being in Aedhgainville, a small town which he deemed to be a nasty parody of all the small towns he knew. It was grotesquely noisier, dirtier, more oppressive and more irritating. He could still smell the faint stench of the midden on his clothes and in his hair. He decided to go to the bathhouse. In the bathhouse, he was annoyed by the expression of the attendant, looking at his Witcher medallion and his sword lying on the edge of the tub. He was annoyed by the fact that the attendant did not offer him a whore. He had no intention of availing himself of one, but in bathhouses everybody was offered them, so he was annoyed by the exception being made for him. When he left, smelling strongly of lye ash soap, his mood had not improved, and Aedhgainville was no more attractive. There was still nothing there that he could find to like. The Witcher did not like the piles of sloppy manure filling the narrow streets. He did not like the beggars squatting against the wall of the temple. He did not like the crooked writing on the wall reading, "Elves to the reservation."
That's exactly the impression I got from the temple quarter in Vizima. You know, this very gritty, gloomy and muddy place full of dirty beggars, hookers, thieves and murderers. You can almost smell the stench that's coming from the pit where they dump the burned bodies of the victims of Catriona plague, and you are half expecting to be mugged and killed by Salamandra in some back alley like Geralt almost was in A Shard of Ice. The swamps also reminded me of the part from the Tower of the Swallow when Ciri is recovering at Visogotha's place in the swamps of Pereplut. And then there are locations like Vizima outskirts or Murky Waters village, which represent the rustic setting of this fantasy world, and those reminded me so much of the Edge of the World short story, with this countryside vibe that evokes folklore and fairy tales. I already talked about the chapel in Govorozhets from the books, and that we have small chapels like that everywhere around the countryside. Well, they are around the Vizima outskirts as well. In the Murky Waters village there are also maypoles. That's a tradition that's still very much alive in my country. I even made a video about it. Then there are noon wraiths in the fields near Murky Waters. We call them polednice in my country, and everyone knows these folklore creatures because of one of our most famous literary works, Kytice by Karel Jaromír Erben. I've also made a video about that. Another aspect I loved about these locations is that the nature and landscape looked like it does in Central Europe. And I love that there are even specific trees and flowers you can often see here. And I think that this is something that was adapted so well from the books, because you can feel it even there when Sapkowski describes woods or meadows in the countryside. It just feels ordinary. I never pictured any kind of fantasy cliché like these epic vistas we know from Lord of the Rings, which every fantasy started to copy, and there always have to be some epic mountains in the background like in New Zealand. Even the main menu in the first Witcher had this view of ordinary countryside, and I felt the same vibe like I do when I'm somewhere on a road between fields and villages, looking in the distance and wondering what adventures could be waiting down there in front of me or even beyond the horizon. Actually, because of this, I usually listen to the soundtrack from The Witcher 1 when I go for a walk and I want to evoke this feeling and atmosphere of folklore and fairy tales I felt in some of the locations from the game. Soundtrack adds so much to the atmosphere of this game, and what I love about it is that it's using simple instruments which you can often hear in Slavic folk music, so it gives the soundtrack this rustic vibe, which is again pretty unique, because fantasy usually uses epic orchestral music for soundtrack, and I'm kind of tired of that. Then there's this creepy horror atmosphere you can feel in Vizima outskirts at night, and also in Vizima cemetery, in crypts, or in the fields near Murky Waters village. That also reminds me of classical fairy tales, which were often pretty morbid and had these horror elements which gave them exactly this creepy atmosphere. And because Sapkowski based the Witcher books on many of these fairy tales, I think that the horror atmosphere you can often feel in the games fits this fantasy world so well. There's probably even more examples I could think of, but yeah, CD Projekt just nailed the atmosphere from the books. There's a YouTuber called Jordan Underneath who used to make videos about horror video games. I love his videos, and especially those about Resident Evil and Silent Hill. This is a short excerpt from his video about the Resident Evil remake.
I know. I spend a lot of time babbling about atmosphere on this channel, and I'm sure that gets annoying. But there is a reason for it. See, I think atmosphere, above all else, is my favorite element in gaming. My favorite thing about video games, period. It drives me insane. If a video game can evoke a powerful mood, a vibe, an emotion, or a feeling, just by painting a world, a small virtual world that I can gaze upon, get lost inside, and use to distract myself from reality, to disappear from existence and vanish off the face of the earth all at once, well, that's what fucking dreams are made of. And this game is good at it. Way too good at it. It hurts me, physically, because it's so good at it.
This is exactly how I feel about the first Witcher game. I just love its atmosphere so much. To summarize the main points of this video, there are 3 reasons why I fell in love with The Witcher, and they all overlap. First of all, it's more realistic and ordinary compared to high fantasy, which is sort of a standard in the fantasy genre. That makes The Witcher more relatable in my opinion. The second reason is that a lot of things in The Witcher are based on our culture here in Central Europe. This makes it more relatable to me as a Czech, because it feels nostalgic and like home. The third reason is that it's unique. As I said, high fantasy is sort of a standard in the fantasy genre. It essentially represents the whole genre, because if you say fantasy to some normies, they'll imagine something like Lord of the Rings, D&D, Skyrim, or something epic like that. I also think that most fantasy worlds are copying each other and they use the same tropes, and because there are so many high fantasy worlds, the idea became generic, at least in my eyes. When you then look at The Witcher as this realistic, ordinary and almost mundane fantasy world, it looks so unique compared to the rest of the fantasy genre. And I know that there's probably more fantasy books similar to that, but the problem is that they are unknown to most people. I'm talking about the mainstream's view of fantasy here. And to explain these points with some specific examples, let's briefly talk about the part of The Witcher that's inspired by history, which I haven't really delved into too much in this video so far. The Witcher is clearly medieval. There were a few idiots over the years who tried to argue with me that it isn't medieval or historical because it's fantasy and pure fiction. It's like with the people who claim that there's nothing Slavic about The Witcher. It seems so dumb to me. Sapkowski uses so many medieval words for authorities, official positions, military or weapons. I keep a list of some of them, which I occasionally update when I find another one in the books, so let's just briefly go through those so you can see for yourself. I have them in Polish, Czech and English, and I'll use a voice from Google Translator for the Polish ones, because I would butcher pronunciation of some of them otherwise. So Velerat from Vizima is called
Grododzierżca
in Polish, Purkrabi in Czech and Castellan in English. Haxo from Cintrian Court is called
Kasztelan
in Polish, Castellan in Czech and Castellan in English. Kaldemain from Blaviken is called
Wójt
in Polish, Voit in Czech and Elderman in English. Neville from Rinde is called
Burmistrz
in Polish, Burgmistr in Czech and Mayor in English. This word comes from the German
Bürgermeister,
if I'm not mistaken. In The Lesser Evil, Geralt mentions Stregobor's mage colleague, Zavist or Zazdrost as he's called in Czech, and Geralt uses the word confrater, which is same in Polish and Czech, and it comes from Latin. In English it's compatriot. Adam Pangrat from Kovir is called
Kondotie
in Polish, condottiere in Czech and condottiero in English. This word comes from Italian language. When Jara is on his way to enlist in the Temerian army, he meets Landsknechts, and that word is the same for all three languages, and it comes from German language. Then there are weapons like
partyzaną,
in Polish, sudlice or partyzana in Czech, and partisan in English.
halabarda,
In Polish, halberda or halapartna in Czech, and halberd in English. Gizarma in Polish and Czech, and gizarm in English. Then there's a specific type of medieval shield which was often used by Hussites, and it's called
paweż,
in Polish, paveza in Czech, and pavis in English. The place where Geralt fights Striga is called
dworzyszcze,
in Polish, dworzyście in Czech, and old manor in English. So these are some of the archaisms and medieval words I've been able to find, but there's definitely more of them which I've missed. So yeah, I think it's clear that The Witcher is heavily inspired by the medieval period. If you know anything about Sapkowski and you've read his Hussite trilogy, you know that the guy is a medieval nut. But I also know that The Witcher is at the same time obviously a mix of different time periods to some extent, because Sapkowski uses things from different periods. For example, the countryside is giving me vibes of the European countryside in later periods. But the basis of the world is medieval, so I think that it should have mainly a medieval look, because you want it to be coherent. And to get back to why I fell in love with The Witcher, the fact that the fantasy is so medieval made it more realistic and ordinary compared to epic high fantasy in my eyes. I think it's more relatable and you don't need suspension of disbelief as much when soldiers wear normal, realistic armor and not something oversized and sometimes even comically huge. I like it more when there are normal swords and medieval weapons. I find the over-decorated swords with all the spikes just dumb because it's clearly impractical. And the same goes for the huge swords with blades so thick that the sword would be super heavy and you couldn't even lift it, let alone fight with it. I know that it's usually magic and the people using these have either some special abilities or their body is just built differently, so they are really strong, but I just prefer the realistic approach. I also really love the normal medieval castles in The Witcher. I'm so tired of these huge epic castles which often have some features like towers which defy physics and gravity. All of this is realistic in The Witcher because it's based on our culture here in Central Europe. That's why it's nostalgic for me, it feels like home, and it's relatable specifically to me as a Czech because I grew up visiting many medieval castles, reenactment events, jousting tournaments and stuff like that. I love that when you compare visuals from The Witcher with something like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is trying its best to be a historically accurate depiction of part of my country's history, the two are almost exactly the same, even though the first one is fantasy and the second one is a portrayal of history. Which brings me to the next point, and that's that I love The Witcher because it's so unique. And that's because there aren't really many realistic medieval fantasy worlds in the mainstream. There's Game of Thrones, but that has the realistic medieval look only when it comes to some armors, and even that isn't always the case. And then there are of course things like the giant ice wall or big dragons flying around. Even the castles are more fantastical than realistic, so I would summarize the fantasy with the word epic and categorize it more as high fantasy. Then there's Fantasy Warhammer, and I love the Landsknechts in that. I sometimes look up different LARP costumes from Warhammer that people have, and they look so awesome. From what I've heard, Fantasy Warhammer is really popular on the Polish LARP scene. There's a Polish LARP called Zweihander and I love their costume guidebook. It reminds me of the art book for Kingdom Come Deliverance or something like that. But back to the topic at hand. Problem with Warhammer is that there are still aspects which I could call high fantasy, like big green orcs or people flying on griffins. There's a reason why Warcraft looks like it does, because from what I've heard it started as a copy of Fantasy Warhammer, and Warcraft is a prime example of high fantasy in my opinion. There isn't really any inspiration from actual history, and it doesn't have the low fantasy look that Fantasy Warhammer has, at least in some places. So even though I like the visual of Fantasy Warhammer, there are still things that I don't enjoy because they remind me too much of high fantasy. So as you can see, there isn't really fantasy like The Witcher, which is a shame. Or maybe I'm wrong and just ignorant, because there is some lesser known fantasy with a great medieval visual. If you know about something like that, please tell me about it in the comments, because I'm hungry for more of this low fantasy medieval style. But I would say that in the end, no medieval fantasy will have this awesome unique mix of medieval visuals with the rustic setting of Slavic countryside, which evokes folklore and fairy tales. There will probably be only one Witcher, and that's fine. It's actually probably better this way. So in conclusion, there's probably more reasons why I fell in love with The Witcher, because there are also really well written characters and story, but I wanted to talk mainly about these three which made The Witcher so appealing to me from the get-go, and that's that the fantasy is more realistic and ordinary compared to epic high fantasy, which makes it more relatable and you don't need to use as much suspension of disbelief, and it's more realistic and ordinary because it's based on our culture here in Central Europe. And because it's more realistic and ordinary and it's based so much on Central Europe, it's unique because the fantasy genre is mostly represented by high fantasy, so when there's something that's so clearly distinctive and different, it will obviously stand out. For example, when fantasy is depicting villages, it usually has this generic medieval look, it's not based on any particular culture, and it doesn't feel realistic because the villagers don't seem authentic and they are like mindless NPCs. And when movies depict the historical element of fantasy, it's usually Hollywood's idea of this Royal English medieval atmosphere, which you can see in Ella Enchanted or Jack the Giant Slayer, for example. Or I grew up with movies like Black Knight with Martin Lawrence or A Kid in King Arthur's Court. It's all this idea of Arthurian legends and English Middle Ages. And I should say that all of these movies are first of all just caricatures of actually English culture and history, which should look very different. Because from what I've heard from my friend who does reenactment as English Knight, English Middle Ages are apparently never portrayed properly in pop culture. Someone mentioned in the comments under my last video that when Americans portray the Middle Ages, it usually looks like a cheesy amusement park. Not always, but I find it to be pretty true. But anyway, my point with this is that when everything medieval in mainstream looks like those Hollywood movies I grew up with, of course The Witcher will look unique when its medieval visuals are mostly based on the history of Central Europe, and it isn't trying to be yet another stereotype of English Middle Ages. So I hope that my babbling made sense and you've enjoyed this video and I didn't bore you with repeating some points over and over. Thanks for watching and see you next time.